So welcome to Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation's Community Lens podcast. We're here today to talk a little bit about the context of Charity Aid Foundation's UK Giving Report. The big headline from that this year was that charitable giving from the UK public has reduced. It's reduced by actually kind of 10%, which feels like a huge amount of money, about 1.5 billion less in 2025 than in 2024. So we're here to kind of have a conversation around that and some of the other issues that have come up through that report. I'm really pleased today to have Steph Thurston from Youth and Families Matter and Francis Davis with me today. And I'm going to start off by asking you both to introduce yourselves. But first I'm going to introduce myself because I think I forgot to do that. So I'm Jacqui Scott and I'm Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. And you two both know that. But Steph, would you go first and just say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I've been working for Youth and Families Matter now, we tend to call ourselves YFM, for almost 12 years. Came to learn a very steep learning curve about the charity sector, having previously worked in commercial property, sort of revenue generation side of things. And nowadays I tend to do everything to do with fundraising and communications in what is a small grassroots hyper-local, as you would refer to it, charity in Totton.
Great. And for those of you who are listening who don't know where Totton is, it's on the waterside edge of the New Forest, isn't it? Yeah. Almost blends into Southampton.
Yeah, so it's within the New Forest, but probably doesn't really always feel like it.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And Francis, would you like to introduce yourself? I feel like I'm going to learn quite a lot about you with your introduction about yourself.
Gosh, well, so came to Hampshire when my dad got a job with the Navy, and so my first volunteering was with Vietnamese boat people who'd been dumped in Thorney Island just outside Hampshire when I was a wee lad, and then I've been washed up here on the coast in Hampshire apart from a little stint up in Church Cookham ever since, and so I've been involved in the social enterprise sector, in the NHS. I'm a carer, and I brought up a family of 4 kids, one of whom is head chef of a restaurant just round the corner.
Oh, you can name names, by the way, Francis.
Okay.
It's not the BBC,
so
you can give him a plug.
Papillon, directly opposite the Mayflower. And yeah, so you've been there, so there we are. And
I haven't, but now I know to go.
Yeah, no, I recommend it. And then so brought the family up locally, and and so kind of my career has been sort of in the intersection of voluntary sector, business, government, and teaching in universities. So I had a couple of spells in central government. Working on disability and on social inclusion, social justice, and stacks and stacks and stacks of volunteers. Never been a time when I've not been volunteering too much by the family standards anyway.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by you mentioning the Vietnamese boat people because when I was a child we looked after a family. Or I don't know what the correct terminology would be, but when I was growing up in New Zealand and obviously, all of that stuff was happening.
Yeah.
And through the church that my family belonged to, we sponsored a family and I just found it wonderful. I had never really met anybody who didn't speak English or who had been through any kind of experience like that at all. And, it was kind of one of those formative things, I think, for me, that you can support somebody in that situation.
Yeah, and I mean, gets inside your skin, you hear their stories, and then I was growing up in Portsmouth, I had friends in the local synagogue who were in my school, and their families had survived the Shoah.
Yeah.
And then another quirk about Portsmouth is when the revolution happened in Zanzibar, the Sultan escaped from Zanzibar, came to live in Portsmouth.
Oh, wow.
So in Fareham now we have the Wessex Jamaat, which is a Swahili-speaking East African community of Muslims, and I grew up playing badminton for them, for the county, and as a result got involved in the work around the aftermath of the Srebrenica genocide, and have done work with the Rwanda genocide. So, so Hampshire can bring the whole world to you, and you can learn from that and then maybe give something away afterwards, whether they're young or they're old or they're struggling or they're frail. So.
It's the very definition of community, I think, isn't it? It's all of those different things coming together into some incredible whole, I think, it's bigger than all of the parts of it.
Yeah, and if you're geeky, you can pretty much walk between all those communities. So I've walked from Totton down to Portsmouth, along the beach at Leon Solent.
That's quite a
It's a nice walk. Yeah, it's part of the Solent Way. So Yeah. So these places are much closer, but I think sometimes we think they're quite far apart, and they're not really, are they? So
another thing that we could say about the sense of community as well, actually, isn't it, is that quite often we imagine that I'm in leafy Lymington and Totton's, half an hour's drive for me, and I can imagine those two things to be completely far apart. But actually, it's not, because we're all human, and we live and breathe the same air. Let's talk about this CAF report. So one of the big issues that it highlighted is this reduction in giving from the UK public. And interestingly, what they're suggesting is that in the past 10 years or so, probably the sector has lost one full year's giving from the UK public. So it's probably sort of 12 or 14 billion pounds that have been lost because over the last 10 years, giving from the public has reduced. So I'm wondering, Steph, if I can firstly ask if you've faced that at Youth and Families Matter, but can you also just talk more widely about kind of the funding environment that you operate with and day to day?
At YFM, I would say we're in a relatively unique position in terms of the fact that we were set up originally in 1993 by Tesco Baptist Church, and we still have a really close relationship with the congregation of that church, and therefore I would say that we probably bucked the trend more in terms of giving, because we have some people who've donated to us, and they're very faithful.
Real stalwarts.
Yeah, very faithful in that. So I would say on the flip side to that, where we have looked to grow fundraising, that's been challenging. So the sort of wider community fundraising, we've put up fundraising appeals and things like that, they don't really net. The support that you receive financially doesn't really match the encouragement that you receive, for instance, on social media. So I wouldn't say that we have seen a reduction in the funds that are donated to us, but I wouldn't say we've been able to grow it either. Yeah. And in the bigger funding context, I suppose, where there is much more competition in terms of grant funds, things like that, what we'd dearly love to do is to be able to obviously grow the funds that we receive through donors, but that hasn't been possible to do. The grant landscape is hugely competitive, very time consuming. And obviously any wins that we have in that landscape, they're restricted. Whereas
thanks funders like us.
and rightly so. Obviously the funder has specific aims and objectives, and your what you're delivering in that sense needs to be tethered to those. That's understandable. However, the charity does also need the flexibility to be able to deliver things, and respond to things and move and shape things that isn't just tethered to grant programs.
To somebody else's idea.
Exactly. Otherwise you could end up with mission drift as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting for you, I think, because Totton is overall not a wealthy area.
No.
And in fact, same with Southampton. Southampton is not a hugely wealthy area either. Yeah. So your universe for non-grant funding is pretty small, I would think, of people who are actually in a position to be able to give you that kind of regular support. So it really makes sense to me that growth of income, of that unrestricted income, would be an issue, that it's not necessarily even strategically the right thing for you to do. So can you say a little bit about the broader funding environment? Because one of my big worries is that as income from Joe Public reduces, and it looks like it is, that's going to put more pressure on the other revenue streams that charities have, and that surely must mean contraction of the number of charities, or contraction in the number of the number of people being supported by charities, which really worries me.
Yeah.
I feel like we know that there's a lot of contraction for the fourth time in what local authorities are going to be able to do to support their community sector. I think it's actually still quite soon with the national government, the current government, to see quite where the money is going to go, although there's some things that are happening that we can see happening now. So that means that in my view, it means that the community sector is all going to funders like us, all going to the National Lottery. I heard somebody say the other day, I'm always recommending people go to the National Lottery. Well, yeah, but the National Lottery also has, you know, a limit to how much it can do. So for you, have you seen or felt any of that recently with your trying to raise money from elsewhere?
Yeah, so I mean the competition for funds through trusts and foundations has been absolutely astronomical over the last year, and funders have quite often responded to that by doing whatever they can to narrow the doorway. Understandably, you know, they have a job to do, and that needs to be manageable for them too. You know, they can't be overwhelmed with applications. You know, they need to somehow narrow that. It seems to me like a lot of that has been moving and shifting the boundaries in terms of income for charities that might be eligible to apply. Moving and shifting specialisms. So, for instance, yes, you might be delivering work with around domestic abuse. However, you can now only apply to us if your charity specialises in domestic abuse. For instance, same with youth, same with homelessness, that side of things. So that's an interesting steer. I would say those kind of eligibility changes have almost always come at the detriment to grassroots charities like Youth and Families Matter, that's providing a range of services that are accessible and that are trusted within their communities. But because, again, we're providing a range of services, it doesn't necessarily mean that our income is tiny. So, yeah, it's interesting. But I totally agree with your point in terms of it's very difficult to think the less income that we have from individuals supporting, obviously, where the charity is aiming for, I suppose you just become more and more directed by trusts and foundations, aims and things like that, and less able to really continue to channel out, I suppose, the unique vision and of that charity, which has ultimately been born out of the place where it is.
And is responding to the people that it's supporting too, right?
Exactly.
It was interesting you saying about narrowing criteria. I spoke to somebody the other day who was applying to a fund of ours, or thinking about applying, and she said, I don't mean to be rude, Jacqui, but I read your criteria 3 times and I still didn't really understand it. And I said, I'm really sorry, because actually that is what funders have ended up doing, is being really trying to narrow what they're saying and talking in that what I describe as highfalutin language. And it's quite exclusionary, isn't it, to try and use words that you're trying to say, don't apply for this fund, it's not for you, but you're not really saying, don't apply for this fund, it's not for you. And that makes it quite difficult for everybody, because the funders are trying to, I think, reduce the impact of all of their fundraising admin by making it clear if the fund's not for you. But we kind of hate saying no as well. So, and we also hate the idea of not letting those really interesting left field things come through as well. So, you know, but last year, well, I'm sure you would be aware of this, Steph, we had one of our funds was more than 10 times oversubscribed. We had £1 million worth of fundraising bids for a fund of about £145,000.
And as a small charity with limited resources, we also don't want to be in a position of applying for funds that we have really no chance of getting. We don't have time to waste, really. So it is better that we know that, you know, we're in with a shot when we're applying and using those resources wisely. So I totally agree with obviously being really clear. I think there's always been a sense that sometimes, you know, there might be hidden criteria that you're being scored upon. But I think increasingly, you know, we all need to be a bit more upfront in terms of what really is it that you're getting at, like you say, behind the language. But for us, I think as a smaller sort of grassroots organisation, as I say, providing support for lots of interconnected challenges within the community. I think what I find difficult is this specialism route. I get why it's going that way, but I think the difficulty is a lot of people come to us with a lot of needs and they would never think to signpost themselves for specialist support for domestic abuse, because quite often they don't realise they're the victim of domestic abuse until we tell them that. So
I was talking to a charity the other day, and they tried to cobble together lots of little specialist pots as a way to kind of respond to the really tough needs of the young people they were working with, but then all of the timing of when each of the pots ran out was slightly different. So the chief exec was having to do, you got a continuity problem, and then the chief exec was having to do a full week's work and then sit up half the night and the weekend doing the funding bid to do the next. And I bet that feels familiar.
It's a massive jigsaw.
And that's a kind of a tyranny, because you want to be doing the work,
Yeah.
and getting back in fresh the next morning, but you've been up till way beyond the end of news night or something, doing another form. So
correct.
and yours are relatively easy compared to some.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I always say that, if you can't get funding from a community foundation, if you can't meet our standards, you're probably not going to be able to manage to meet anybody's. So we do try to kind of support people in that, and not just to be pig-headed about things. When we say every charity has to submit a safeguarding policy to us, we mean that, because actually you need a safeguarding policy. You need to have done your thinking around that. You need to have your practice in mind, and you need to, everybody who's volunteering or working for you needs to know what to do. So, we try to make the bar as low as possible, but without it, being risky low, sort of thing. It's an interesting moment, I think, to start talking about trust in charities, actually, because one of the things that the CAF report was implying is that there has been this sort of loss of trust in charities. And I always find that a really frustrating thing to hear, particularly working in the sector. And I talk to people from charities every single day. You're talking to the people who are utilising charities' services every single day. You've been involved in, dozens, if not more. And I feel like charity is actually, it's a very British thing. I always think of it as being invented by the Brits, and I'm sure there's somebody who's going to argue against that. That's fair enough. But, when you go back to Andrew Carnegie saying it's irresponsible or immoral to die with money because you can do so much with that money, that's a really, like, that Victorian philanthropy thing. It's a really, really kind of, it's the right thing to do, British sort of value. And then you hear people say, but nobody trusts them. Charities can't be trusted. Look what happened at unnamed charity working with young people. And I find that quite difficult, because I think that there is a lot of trust in charities. Francis, I'm going to throw it open to you to have a...
Well, I think one of the interesting things, if I remember correctly, is there was a big row about an unnamed charity working with young people, and then there was a big review. And the review said, actually, it was nowhere near as bad as the media originally said. So there's something about the reporting. I mean, there are lots of big organisations, bigger charities, aren't they, that do brilliant work. So Mind is phenomenal, Bernardo's and others. Seems to me the real challenge around trust is that link to the local. So if I'm running Monty's Bikes on Thornhill, no one's heard of me in Winchester. But if you
that's okay.
Yeah, but that's okay. But if you walk into the bike shed and you meet the kids and they're telling you how their life's being transformed by the work that Josh, who runs Monty's Bike, is doing, you know instantaneously that the levels of trust in the room are so high that everybody in the county ought to be piling in behind them. And I'm sure it's the same at your place. So it seems to me that there's kind of a mismatch between those that can build a big brand, and so you kind of trust it because you kind of go, I'm lazy. You go, I trust my bank because of this, and I'll trust this charity because of that. And so you then have this great big world underneath where we need to build it up. And I think because we live in social silos, we don't get to see enough of those kinds of organisations, and so we forget or we never discover just how many fantastic people there are who decided to work at less than the going rate.
Oh, much less than the going rate.
Or to stay at home, to have the get up and stay at home to address some of these pressing needs. And the first we might hear about a charity, particularly in Hampshire, is if we're commuting out of the county up to London or into a very, very long hours kind of job. And so kind of like we use these shortcuts, like we heard about it at the tennis club or something, and we don't get connected to that. And so that trust bubble gets smaller. And it's a tragedy because there are just fantastic people in every neighbourhood.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those examples like Monty's are amazing because the level of trust within that one estate where that work is being delivered is so huge. And I hate to think of it being what would happen if you removed it, but kind of what would happen if you removed it. And it's such a pity because I think so much work that gets done by the charitable sector is prevention and action, but you only feel it if it's gone. But actually it's what makes us safer. A good analogy, I think, is education. So we all pay for education through our taxes. And whether we have children or not, we're paying for education through our taxes. And the reason we do that is because that benefits all of us, because an educated population means that we can, have better business, and, you'll have more clients and so on, and all of that. And it's kind of the same in the charity sector, I think, is that supporting charities per se makes society better, because there's so much work that's being done that strengthens communities.
Yeah, and I'll give you kind of two concrete examples of that. So firstly, in my own family, we had a family member became suddenly very, very ill, and it never occurred to me that I'd ever be looking for anybody in that space. And the only person that could step in and help was kind of like a youth helpline that we then absolutely relied on to talk us through how the system wasn't working, so that we could kind of press all the buttons to try and unlock the service. But until it happened, you'd never even kind of like think about it. And even more concrete than that was I was in the Saints pub on Millbrook, which is a big estate on the west of town, and 4:00 on a Saturday they have a meat draw to raise money for the paediatric intensive care unit up at the General. And I was talking to one of the mums, and she said, well, when we needed it, by God did we need it. So that's why we're doing the meat draw every week. Right, and it's that kind of basic kind of...
Yeah, and often I think people don't understand that in the background is this organisation that's running on a shoestring, is often looking at their bottom line with abject fear. But interestingly, I think your example of your family member is really interesting. I spoke to a good friend recently who's had been diagnosed with a very unpleasant health condition. And I said, have you looked for the charities that work in that space? And he said, well, we've talked to this organisation, but it's a society. And I thought, well, it's a charity, and I think people often interact with charities without even really realising that it's a charity, and that means all of the stuff behind it, which means the fundraising, and they're trying to build trust in build trust so that your clients come to you, but also build trust in you as an organisation to get the profile you need to fundraise.
I think people would like to trust that charities are going to be there for them when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the incredible thing is that they are. I mean, we know that there's been some closures recently, and I think that there'll be some more. We won't be too surprised to see a few more, which I think is really sad, because of the impact that has on that community. I guess it does sort of take us into the next kind of thing I thought would be interesting to talk about, which is that thing about, are there too many charities? Is there duplication? Do you feel like there's somebody down the road doing the same thing as you? Do you feel like of all of the different charities you've volunteered with or sought support for, that someone else could have done the same job? I'll leave it to both of you. You can find it out.
You go first.
Okay. We're inundated with referrals. I think that speaks volumes for itself, to be honest. I can't believe that we would be if there was anybody. We're getting to the point where we've got waiting lists for many of our services now, really, trying to avoid it, but we may have to bring that in. I think the position that we have within the community as well, we're often called upon to do more, simply because we're there and nobody else is providing those services. So no, I would say it completely shocks me, to be honest, that there isn't more duplication, because there is this idea of so many charities and there is so much competition for funds, and yet nobody else seems to be doing some of these things, certainly in our working area anyway. I can't obviously speak for what goes on outside of the immediacy of Totton, but the example, for instance, we have homelessness support has always been core to the work that YFM's provided, simply because we are supporting people with many interconnected, social and hardship issues. But basically, we've been asked to do more. And we've been asked last year. We were asked to do more, and we provided a dedicated drop-in now around this. So it had come to the point where it was completely dominating a food larder session that we run with Fair Share on a Wednesday, and we came to the point where we realised it needed something separate. So we worked with New Forest District Council. We now provide a dedicated drop-in and some casework alongside that. But it's still not enough. And there is nobody else doing that groundwork. There is nobody else connecting those dots and doing the work that it takes for providers to be able to house somebody. It takes that groundwork to be able to get somebody into a position where they can be housed. We're looking at what we can now do beyond that. because again, nobody's providing the outreach work. So we're thinking, okay, well, without housing stabilisation, that situation falls over, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Actually, when you get somebody to the point where they're housed, that's when the good work begins.
Yeah.
They have an address. They can engage with alcohol services.
Yeah.
If addiction's a problem, they can engage with inclusion. They can engage with mental health because they actually have, the means at that point, the address and stability to be able to engage with some of those services that can provide real change.
Yeah.
So we need to invest in that. But again,
Yeah.
nobody else is doing that. So now we're having to think about, okay, well, now we're doing this bit. Well, we've kind of got to do that extra bit, really, for it to become meaningful. So before you know it, you're doing more, but you're doing it because nobody else is.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really good example of the sort of thing where if it didn't exist, we would all know that, right?
Yeah.
Because you would have families on the street. And what you're trying to do, you're obviously trying to provide an environment for those families and for those people which is better than what they have. And we don't see it because it's not us. But if it wasn't happening, we would see it.
Since the Housing Hub has been running, which has only been since September, we estimate with New Forest District Council it's saved about £140,000
Wow.
in costs.
Wow, that's amazing.
Because, they have some kind of metric which estimates for the homelessness prevention team, and that's the kind of metric of cost saving that it has. But obviously it's about more than that. It's about breaking, those cycles, that cause that housing instability to start with.
Yeah.
But nobody
else
is doing it
on your patch, yeah.
So it's kind of doing it because you kind of have to, really.
Yeah. But also it's another good example of charities being responsive and, when people talk about is there duplication, are there too many? Well, you're doing what you can to reduce costs elsewhere. You're working with other charities. You're looking at the problem and thinking, okay, what have we got that we can bring to this party?
And
and being innovative.
Coming back to this point of not being completely specialist. So yes, we have a specialist within the team who leads on this. But actually, sometimes people have come to us for another level of support, and actually they're happy to take on board the advice and support from us
because they trust
they're
you.
already being supported, because they're already trusting us in another area, and because we're independent.
Yeah.
That is a key thing for us. Is the fact that
you're not the government.
Yeah, particularly when it comes around to anything in terms of people's finances and things, they can be really wary. Actually, a lot of the time they only stand to gain. But they're naturally very wary that if they give you some information that they might lose something.
Yeah.
And so it's really important, the fact that they're independent, that we're independent, that they can trust us. They're more likely to be open with us about what's really going on, but they're also more likely to take on board the advice that we're giving them.
Yeah.
Because we don't have an agenda in it.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
there's
exactly.
also something, isn't there, about keeping it local, right? Because these things are needs-based. It's not like someone wakes up one day and says, I haven't got a job, I'm going to found a charity as a way to skim some cash out of the place, right?
Yeah, wouldn't
It's
be a
not
good
like
one.
Wrong approach.
No, it's
That's their
completely.
thinking.
Firstly, they'd be the wrong ones and they shouldn't get registered. But normally they're kind of like responding to a need, aren't they? And then, so you might say, let's all be cost effective and go to scale, right? So we want to make a lot of shampoo, so we're going to have big global factories. But we know what happens then, don't we? Which is that we have mums and dads in Hampshire whose kids have been sent to a psychiatric unit at the other end of the country and it doesn't work.
That's awful.
So something about if you've got to organise at the local level, you can also meet need where it's at. And then you need a variety of organisations, because the needs even of Tom on Monday may be different on Wednesday or Thursday, and a different kind of organisation in the same space might be able to flex around that, so Tom becomes more stable and supported. So I think variety is really, 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 really good. The challenge then, isn't it, though, is that you end up with 30 lots of rent, 30 lots of receptionists.
30 chief executives.
Yeah. And so there's an opportunity there to pull some of the back office, to share some skills. Faith groups are much better at some other bits of the voluntary sector. And the tragedy is when normally when government tries to coordinate it, because they probably normally coordinate it in such a way that they drive up the costs of the charity, because they spend lots of time spending money being coordinated. And so I think the role of a community foundation or larger organisations to act as a convener, so that back office can be shared, like the potential there is enormous. Because then you can do it really cost effectively. There's a really good example I went to visit a few years back in London, where a particular foundation funded by the the Pears family.
Is this Pears of the Soap family?
That's what I thought, but apparently it's not. It's Pears of something else. But
Oh.
they're a Jewish family, and they made their money in the family business, put some money into a foundation, and they noticed that quite a lot of charities with a turnover of 100,000 to $1 million were asking for someone in reception, or some help with a secretary, so that the mainline staff could go out and do more frontline work. And so they created what they call an innovation hub, and they had pooled secretaries and pooled receptionists, and let everybody kind of cohabit in one space to cut their back office costs, so they could spend even more on the front office. So I think there is space for innovation like that, but there's also space, isn't there, for more donors who will come along and say, I'm from Winchester, or I'm from Fleet or Church Crookham, and I'm going to be really committed to the young people of Totton, or those struggling on Thornhill, or those with potential in Lee Park, rather than only maybe but getting very, very excited about being invited to a high net worth donors drinks party up in London where everyone else has got a title, but actually in the process, whilst you're having a lot of fun whilst doing your giving, you might be missing Lee Park. Just round the corner. And I'm not knocking all of that. I mean, in fact, I think it's really, really good when it happens. But you might be accidentally getting on a train out of a place where your pound could go 5 times further because it's just right next door with someone that never goes to London.
Yeah. And I think actually that's a really interesting point, because I think that I find Hampshire interesting. I spent 20 years living in London. I find it interesting in that there are there's charities that everybody sort of knows in Hampshire, but not that many. Whereas when you're in London, that's where those big name charities are based, and so everybody knows, you know, the NSPCC and the National Trust and all of that sort of thing. So if you are a wealthy family or a wealthy person in a place like Hampshire where you're a couple of steps away from that, it can be quite hard to kind of work out, okay, I'm quite interested in being involved in that way and meeting other people who are using their philanthropy in that way, but how can I achieve that locally? And it is quite an interesting one, because it's community foundations who can kind of offer that. And, you know, in Hampshire, we are Hampshire's best kept secret. I'd like us to be Hampshire's worst kept secret, you know, but there are lots of different things that drive people to make donations. But a tiny charity, not being pejorative, but a tiny charity like YFM, you're not going to be able to put on a glamorous event, sponsored, by the way, for, you know, to support that kind of networking amongst, you know, high net worth people. You're going to do something in a church with, you know, great tea and coffee and excellent cakes, you know, and it's community foundations who are able to kind of work through that kind of issue, I think.
Yeah, and I think going back to where we began the conversation as well, in terms of the impact of lower donor income, you know, for charities generally, it makes it harder to justify communications and that side of things as well. And, you know, a common frustration, I think, you know, within charities is, well, people won't know unless we tell them, obviously, the impact that we're having, you know, the work that we're doing. But at the same time, we just don't have the resources to do that. So, having the community foundation to be able to communicate that impact on our behalf. But, I mean, it's only become a self-fulfilling thing, really.
Yeah.
The less, you know, income charities have, the less scope they have to do some of that side of things.
Absolutely.
I mean, times are tough. So at one level, I'm not surprised that money's gone down, isn't it? Because what we know is there's a lot of people my age didn't go back to work after lockdown. So that's just a lot of people out of the workplace. A lot of people worried about their interest rates. Now they're going to be worried about what's happening, you know, the Iran war. But I think also there's just something about, you know, remembering that relatively small amounts of money in multiples go incredibly long way. So daft thing, just recently we ran my first meal out for 40 children who'd been selected from schools in Southampton because they'd not had a meal out. We brought them into the Civic Centre. They went for a walk round the debating chamber. Then they sat down to a 2-course meal with the mayor, having been formally introduced to my Lord Mayor, and they all had a photo to go home. And how do we raise the money for that? Well, it's 15 families that would normally take their family out for a Pizza Express, didn't go to Pizza Express that fortnight. And so we put together all their Pizza Expresses and job done, 40 kids
Yeah,
have had their little meal. One of them went home with baguette full of coleslaw and potatoes and
Oh, I would have
turkey
done too.
in his little blazer and things like that. So I think also when we're thinking, some people have got the capacity to be able to make some large strategic grants, and I think if they can partner with a charity like yours, for example, over a period of time, it makes a big difference. But some people probably know 40 people that if you did it regularly, something together, the impact would be out of all proportion of what you might imagine when you put £10, when you get hassled in the town centre by Macmillan or somebody trying to get you to sign your life away outside the bank.
You're much better to look at Give Together, Give Local through Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation.
You haven't got reps on the street harassing on the way to the supermarket.
But actually, I love that example of taking those kids out for dinner, because often when we're having conversations with potential donors, that kind of thing is like, that's a nice to do. Why would you do that? And actually, I think that's really important life skills for kids to learn. I know there's a charity over on the island that we've supported, Sways, South West Area Youth, who have done exactly that as well. And the whole point of it is that their families can't afford to do it. But what about if that kid gets to college or goes to uni and they've never experienced eating with people that aren't their family or eating out? That's really isolating. So that kind of work, it's gentle but social inclusion work, I think.
Yeah, and in military Hampshire, who taught you how to do a toast as we taught them how to do a host, right? And actually, who taught you how to use your knife and fork? And some of the kids who came didn't know how to use a knife.
Yeah.
Right? So, and the kids in Pompey who've never been to the beach.
Yeah.
So don't kid yourself, this isn't happening right next to us.
I was going to say exactly the same, and what you say is true. In a sense, it is sometimes the nice to do, and we've definitely done a lot less trips in the last couple of years than we ever used to, because it's harder to justify, unless we're getting funds specifically for that purpose. You don't want to...
When you say a trip, what do you mean?
So it would be getting a coach and taking families to the beach. Yeah, because we have got families we're working with who haven't, like you said, ever been to the beach. Yeah,
and there's a school in town here that the bit of money they had ran out, so that was no camping trips to the New Forest.
And it's...
Yeah. So now we've sorted they're going to go to Petersfield, but it's 25 minutes. Teachers have given up their time to take them camping, and then there wasn't the money to pay for the campsite. And it's not a lot of money, is it?
No, I know.
And a trip's what cost of a coach? That's probably quite expensive.
Yes, I was going to say,
And, yes, it'll be the coach that's the price of it.
Yeah,
anyone got a coach out there?
Talk to Youth and Families Matter. I find it really disappointing that it's hard to justify that, because actually I absolutely would describe myself as middle class, and I think one of the things that defines me as middle class is that I spend money to do stuff with my kids, that we spend money and go to London to the theatre, we go to the Mayflower, we go out for dinner, my children are horse riders and so on. And to me, it's an absolute no-brainer, because I can't do all of the things that give them the skills and their character and all of that within the bounds of my tiny home. But being able to spend money to do that kind of stuff, it's part of what's making them into good, well-rounded adults. And I don't understand why that's a difficult thing for people to understand, because it is really important.
For us, our family trip programme was always very consciously about the fact that we're working with families who are often dealing with really difficult things, either in the short term or the very long term. But it was really valuable for us to be able to offer them positive family memories. So in amongst of whatever situation they were going through, that there would be some of those core memories, and there would be support on hand, so that people could manage situations that they wouldn't have done independently. But you're right, it is things that we probably had to deprioritise over the last couple of years.
Such a pity, isn't it? You learn so much. I'm thinking about your coach, but if the coach is late, well, one of the skills you're learning is patience and resilience and how to cope with unusual or unexpected circumstances, and that's what all that kind of skill is the sort of thing that those
and
trips
rehearsal
do.
of situations. When you've got people with very complex mental health needs, they often just don't leave their homes, let alone the area. Just practicing, some of the other trips we've done over the years in other settings, not just families, has focused on using public transport, rehearsing some of those skills to maybe encourage people to then do those things again. Maybe they wouldn't still have the confidence to do them alone, but they might do them with, for instance, another member of a group, for instance.
And there's something about, isn't there, the your attitude. So very early this morning, I was in a school where 40% of the parents have got some kind of connection with the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
It's not their kids' fault.
Yeah.
So the 199 kids in those schools deserve the county getting together to give them a break, but it's going to give us a break because they're not going to be breaking into you in 10 years.
Yeah, breaks the cycle.
So it's win-win-win all the way through.
Yeah.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, you get someone who's lonely and frail, and I can just hear friends of mine even going, well, it's their own fault because they've been on the booze all their life, or they've been on the fags or whatever. Well, we all know people who are middle class and
who have had the occasional gin and tonic of a Friday.
But they're just lucky enough to be able to fund very good healthcare, or they're sitting in a great big house, miserable and lonely and struggling with the booze. But so give the ones with nothing a break. And that's like,
I don't think that's unreasonable.
So so if there's been a drop, then we all need to do a bit more. But also there's just something about encouraging the government to look at the frameworks around it. Maybe they're not as flexible, and then there are some exceptions to that. So how do we celebrate that? So. There was a report that came out at the same time as the CAF one, pointing to the Muslim community as the single most generous community per capita, because it was at the end of Ramadan when all the zakats going out the door, it's an absolute fortune, and there are other subcultural groups around or minority groups around the country where the giving is above. So what's the good practice? How do we learn from them? And how do we celebrate what's good in their practice? So that they give more, right? Win-win-win all the way through. I bet 100%. Military charities locally maybe still do quite well. Because people feel that affinity from what local places have been through.
I'm conscious that we need to draw to a close, so I'm going to throw a challenge to both of you as your final statement. So if you think about who might be listening to the podcast today, when we think about sort of the three things that we talked about, which is, are there too many charities? Is there a problem with trust in charities and dealing with the squeeze on income? What would be the one or two things that you would want listeners to take away from your experience? What would be the message you want them to hear from you? Shall I go to Francis first? Let Steph think.
I think some of the people who might be listening in a county as talented as Hampshire might not appreciate just how talented they are and what resources they've got to share. We've got some really capable people that might think that some property deals are so small, they're the sorts of things they do in the margins of their own time. But to a community centre or a community group, that might save them the difference, a few £1,000s of difference that then would unlock their service in a fresh way. So something about stepping back and going, what are the talents that you've got that could be shared in a fresh way? Might even be shareable whilst you commute up and down from Basingstoke on the train. So I think there's that one. Secondly, it's, have you ever counted the number of coffees you've had and the number of meals out that you do as a family as a matter of course, and the number of theatre trips you've done, and just gone, this year we're going to do 5% less so that kids in your project can go on a trip, right? And then there's just something about what do we do with our friends when we celebrate, and could we add into our usual social circle of fishing, shooting, cycling, whatever your thing is. Could one of those be a fundraiser for a group that would never have dreamt of being fundraised for someone like you? And I think that way we just unlock a bit of extra channel. So out there, Hampshire, there are brilliant people. Let's just think about it in fresh ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Because charities are doing that all the time, thinking about things in fresh ways.
Yeah.
It probably is that sense of just getting to know your local charities. If you don't already know who's operating within your community and what it is they're doing, just get to know them. And like you say, those small ways you can help, even if you haven't got big financial gifts to give and things like that. The small ways that you can help and support, and even just be an advocate for your local charity. I think the distance of separation between us and them isn't always as big as people think. If you were to come in, people might not think they would identify with the beneficiaries of charities, but if they were to come in, they might realise, there's more to this. Actually, I can completely relate to this aspect of somebody's story, or I can completely see why this person needs help. But it's very difficult for charities to communicate those very personal stories at a local level. Just get to know your local charities. I'm sure there's more you can do than just giving.
Hampshire ought to be against the trend, not follow the trend.
Yeah. Thank you both very, very much. Steph from Youth and Families Matter, Francis, HIWCF Ambassador, I must say. Thank you both enormously for your time today. Really appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.